I would like to quote some words of wisdom to you guys by one of the founding fathers. As Benjamin Franklin once said, there are only two things certain in life, death and taxes. And I agree with him. What do they say about great minds? We seem to have blended the two and created a third, the death tax. The principle of inheritance tax is something I am deeply opposed to. I want a society where people are encouraged to work hard, achieve things and benefit from that success. When they do, I'd like them to be freely able, should they choose, to share that success with their children upon their death without it incurring further taxation. Why should hard-earned assets or money that has already likely been taxed be taxed again just because somebody has died? I'll keep it simple. It shouldn't be. It's time to give that lasting kiss of death to the unfairness that is inheritance tax.
Michelle, as I understand your argument, you think this money's been taxed already. Is that the case?
Yeah, and I know what you're going to come at me and say. There's double taxation everywhere. It's the principle.
No, I'm not going to say that. What I'm going to say is actually the truth is most of this money, most inheritance is taxes to do with your house, particularly the south of England, is to do with your house. You haven't paid any tax on the gain you've made on your house. So if you bought it years ago for 100,000 and when you die it's worth $1 million, you've paid no tax on that.
No,
Secondly, if you look at the relief that is now available, actually £1 million house you'll pay no tax on. Well, so you're actually talking about letting off people who have got quite a lot of money. And I've got no problem with taxing that. There's all sorts of ways you can get around inheritance tax to make it fairer. Yeah, there are a lot of people, and a lot of people use it. But in the end of the day, why should your kids just become rich because you became rich? Do you think, in principle, then, that kids should be able to inherit everything that their parents have got?
I think if you work hard, and by the way, as a disclosure, no offence to my parents, but I will inherit nothing, so there's no personal thing here for me. I think that I want people to be encouraged to work really hard, to take risks where required, and sometimes you'll gain from that and sometimes you won't. And actually, when you talk about house prices, they have increased massively. Yeah. Children, particularly in London, will struggle to get on that housing ladder. So should they inherit the house? Yes, they should.
I think there's an interesting dynamic of change here as well, where because house prices have gone up so much, the fact that a family has to sell the asset just to pay for the inheritance tax doesn't sit comfortably with a lot of people. So I can sort of understand. It'd be interesting to see if there's a shift here where we can get rid of inheritance tax but maybe have a capital gains tax on property sales. If it's your primary home, you don't pay any gain. So if you make £500,000 as an example on your property, if that's your primary residence, you don't pay any tax. Maybe we should introduce a capital gains tax on property and get rid of inheritance tax, because actually it's very complicated. It's pretty meaningless in terms of the overall tax, and it puts the burden on the family to do something that maybe they don't want to do.
But it's not that complicated. It's in April it's going to change this year, but up to now it's anything over 325 grand is taxed at 40%. You're allowed to have 325 grand's worth. Anything over that at 40. I think the shocker for a lot of people is 40%. To most people, they go, that's the government are going to take nearly half. If they just lowered that 40% to maybe 20%, that would people would stomach that a lot more easily, don't you think?
I mean, I we've talked about how house prices have gone up a lot. That's very much a southern thing, isn't it? And a lot of this is about the south. And one of the reasons inheritance tax is so unpopular, I know, is with people, say, in the north of England who haven't seen that rise, for whom £325,000 is a lot of money, and therefore this is something that affects well-off people. But what I would say is that I think actually that's often a misperception, because people, like you said, Michelle, work really, really hard. I know people who have worked in the public sector their whole lives on low salaries, have made huge sacrifices just to be able to buy a house and be able to leave something to their families. And I don't know anything about your personal tax affairs, Greg, but people like you who can afford accountants often get round inheritance tax by getting round the 3 to 7 year rule, passing on assets long before they die. And so I think what often happens with inheritance tax is actually it's not the really rich that benefit, because they get around it. It's the kind of people in the middle. You know, we hear the cliche of the squeeze middle, but it really is true. People who aren't really well off, they're not this global financial elite. They're just working people who try really hard.
It's not. Come April this year, every person is going to be allowed 500 grand's worth before you have to pay inheritance tax. And so that's between a couple.
It's actually more than that, because if your mum and your mum and dad have both died and they passed it on together, and you get the house, it's £1 million.
Yes.
Now, I have to say, I don't.
The squeezed middle don't have that.
The squeezed middle. If you get £1 million, if you can get £1 million first,
yes.
I don't have a lot of sympathy if you have to pay 40% above
that.
that.
But if it's based on the fact that house prices have gone up in your parents' generation, and then you, as the inheritor, if that's the right word, you then have to sell the asset in order to pay the tax. I think that's the bit for me that, I mean, obviously it gets complicated when you start looking at areas.
You're talking about super rich then, because
no, you're not. You're talking about a two-parent family with a house worth £1 million. Take a single parent, a single parent with a house worth £600,000.
I need to pick up on your point. You've just said we're referring to the super rich with a house over £1 million.
Someone in the north would think you were super rich if you had a house worth too.
I am from the north, and I have a house in the north. I also have a house in London, and my family cannot believe the house prices.
Yes.
So when you say the super rich, they have a house in London for £1 million, just to put some context into that house for £1 million of a super rich person, for anyone that maybe doesn't live in London, you are not super rich to own a house.
The tax is not going to affect anyone with £1 million.
If you can buy a house that is a decent-sized family house in a decent area for £1 million, you're doing well. You're not super rich to have, and it's unfathomable to to me as well. That sometimes the house prices.
You misunderstood what I said. I said over £1 million. People buying houses over $1 million are rich. Okay,
no,
take the words.
They're not rich. It's not just about $1 million.
Ask your mum if someone buying a house worth £1 million is rich.
Do you know what my mum would say? Someone buying a house over £1 million is bonkers.
Yes,
the kind
exactly.
of the house that you get, but you have to, because that is the market.
Well, OK. I don't think we'll agree on that.
What you're trying to say is you just disagree with me. You're trying to put it nicely. I hear you.
No, what I'm saying is I think once you get up to talking about £1 million, you can get £1 million.
I think it's disingenuous to keep talking about $1 million. It's $500,000 per person.
If you've got,
there are a lot of people who are not, especially at that age.
But if you have two parents and they work together, they can use each other's allowance. There's all sorts of things. But you now can have the house as well up to £1 million. So it seems to me.
That's 2020, by the way, that £1 million thing.
Yeah, but I don't have a great deal of sympathy for people having to pay some tax on anything above £1 million. I really don't.